We're going to take a small step into the 17th century, the 1690s now, and look at some papers from that time period. One small step for me, maybe not a giant leap for humankind, we'll see. And I wanted to thank Lynn as well for the invitation to speak today and to share a little bit about record keepers and account managers and catalog makers in the late 17th century, and for putting me on a panel about catalogs. I saw that and said, oh boy, I better find a catalog to talk about. So here we are talking about catalogs in the 17th century. So what I want to talk about today is exploring women's roles in scientific and household record keeping and communication in early modern Britain. And let me just make sure I know how this thing works. There we go. Okay, good. Through this work, women working often in domestic spaces where much of the labor of scientific knowledge making and experiment and observation took place in the 17th century, they made knowledge as well as homes, and they also connected into and participated in wider networks of colonial commerce and science. So it's those movements that I'd like to think about today, along with the ways in which women and paper keepers and record keepers more generally sometimes get effaced from our records and from our understanding of how work is being done and who's doing it. Within households, but also within other spaces of record keeping, data making, and catalog making. And I think that turning the attention to the people in this particular context is something that I've really been led to by looking at the scholarship written by archivists about their institutions and about how they function. So I just wanted to highlight their scholarship today and the role it's had in my own thinking. So in recent years, historians of science have opened up the home in early modern Europe as a site for producing natural and medical knowledge. And this is Margaret Cavendish, who we'll talk about in a second. Early contributions in this field tended to present scientific workspaces as distinctly masculine spaces within an early modern English household, otherwise dominated by women. So for example, in her study of John and Jane Dee's natural philosophical household, Deborah Harkness excavated a world in which a wife's duties to provide hospitality and support her husband's work conflicted with that work. From Jane's perspective, the Elizabethan magus John Dee's alchemical, astrological, and magical natural philosophy brought disrepute upon their household. So natural philosophy rested uneasily in the home. Often, in the words of one important collection of essays on women in early modern science in England from the late 1990s, the women who are present in these domestic spaces are described as mothers and sisters. They're living in the neighborhood of science. This language often seems to suggest that natural philosophy, natural history, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, and alchemy, other observational and experimental processes that I'm kind of roughly allowing to fall within the orbit of science in this talk today, these activities are going on around these women, but they're not necessarily active participants. They're aware of it, perhaps sympathetic, but essentially shut out of the process. And I think that somebody like Margaret Cavendish, who's a natural philosophical author in the 1660s, is representative of the ways in which then women who participate in the sciences can be cast as doing something that's unusual or crossing deliberate or crossing gendered boundaries in some way. So the rare woman natural philosopher like Margaret Cavendish is presented as an outlier, an exception from her sex, rather than typical of it. And this is true not least of the exception herself, who presented herself as crossing both sort of gendered boundaries and philosophical boundaries as well. Comments made by Mary Evelyn about Cavendish, and Evelyn is the wife of the Restoration virtuoso John Evelyn, are taken as paradigmatic. Evelyn questioned Cavendish's attention to her philosophical children at the expense of attention to domestic responsibilities, so as if these are mutually exclusive realms. And what I hope to talk about is some of the ways in which they are, in fact, kind of co-constitutive of each other. Scholars have subsequently illuminated a fuller picture of household, experimental, natural philosophical, mathematical, and healing labor, one that incorporates men and women's roles and the exchanges and collaborations between them. So this is the opening title page of Hannah Woolley's Queen-like Closet from the mid-1670s, and it's sort of emblematic of the ways in which we've begun to see these realms crossing over, so that it's a series of images of a woman active in the kitchen, and in the middle on the left is the image of the woman with the alembic, distilling medicines in the sort of kitchen kitchen space, providing for the household, but also engaged in a kind of experimental labor and intellectual labor of her own. So we have scholarship now that brings together and places women in the picture. I hope to participate today in that scholarship and expand it in a couple of ways. One, by looking specifically at information management. So looking at the habits of paper keeping and the organization of knowledge within the home and who's doing that work and how. So this can include everything from organizing correspondence, taking dictation, transcribing letters and other kinds of materials, translating texts and editing them. It's a sort of all of the work that goes into managing scientific books and papers and as gendered labor within households. It can include as well account keeping and making catalogs. And this paperwork of science, the paperwork of sort of domestic experimentation, is really closely connected to household practices of management, of account keeping, of provisioning the household, of maintaining the records of the family. I also look at women's roles in fostering hospitality and in developing and maintaining the social connections that sustained natural philosophical conversation, and seeing these as connected as well, the work of record keeping and the work of hospitality, particularly in the form of the letter, which is a genre that crosses between and connects people in the early modern period. So today, thinking about some of these topics, I want to focus on particular catalog making, the work of making catalogs in the late 1690s, and how they connect people, they connect objects and people, they connect objects to places, and how they are sort of made by various actors in this period and how they fit into sort of household practices of account keeping and record keeping. And then also how they connect the households and individuals into wider British imperial networks. So there are four main ways I'd like us to think about the role of catalogs and cataloging practices in this period. So the first thing we'll be keeping our eye out for today is thinking about catalogs in the context of a personal relationship, as a list or an account that is made by one person for or another, or with the help of others, so in the context of personal relationship. And I want to think about catalog making moments, so the moments when people feel it's necessary to construct a catalog, often moments of transition for a collection of books or papers, when they're passing from one owner to another, when one owner has died, or when they're being moved from one home to another. So thinking about what are the moments in which we make catalogs and why. I want to think especially about the relationship between accounts and catalogs. So financial records, property records, accounts that are drawn up in the course of litigation over the inheritance of property, how catalogs and accounts can sort of function in parallel and in tandem and are part of similar practices of recording knowledge and recording objects and linking objects to places and people to places and objects. And then finally, in the context of late 17th century science, I want to think about the ways in which a catalog can be a record of experimental practice. So how it can have value as an experimental record. So today, kind of illuminating all of these questions, I want to take a look at a catalog that was composed by Cassandra Willoughby in 1692. And this is a catalog of the plants that are growing in the garden, the Physik garden or medical garden at Woollerton, which is a place I'll explain as we go along. So in 1687, Cassandra Willoughby, who was then late in her teenage years, about 18 or 19, moved with her older brother Francis to Woollerton Hall in Nottinghamshire. The siblings were escaping the home of their mother Emma and their stepfather Josiah Child, who's a wealthy East India merchant and also a founding member of the Royal African Company, which is the English joint stock company that is managing and expanding England's share of the slave trade in the late 17th century. Cassandra and her brother were the children of Emma's marriage to the naturalist Francis Willoughby, who had partnered with the botanist John Ray in the 1660s and early 1670s to reconstruct the natural history of the world. If you think of them as sort of the immediate forerunners of Linnaeus, you wouldn't be too far off in that regard. Ray was to take the plants, Francis Willoughby the elder, the insects, birds, and fishes. Ray and Willoughby were prominent early fellows of the Royal Society of London. They participated in developing the vocabulary for John Wilkins's real character, an ideal scientific language meant to create rational correspondences between words and things, a project that anyone interested in controlled language for cataloging should have a soft spot for. And indeed, that's what they hoped to use it for, as a language that could be used for cataloging nature. And they also jointly conducted experimental research into insects and plants, traveling in Britain and the continent and collecting natural specimens and visiting various sites on the continent. Their plan to entirely renovate the study of nature was cut short by Francis Willoughby's death in 1672, but Ray continued their project in his friend's memory after his death, and this resulted in the publication of volumes on fishes, birds, and insects, the first two lavishly illustrated. Ray continued on in the Willoughby household after his friend's death for a time, where he served as a tutor for his children. So there's a kind of extended relationship that continues between John Ray and Frances, Cassandra, and Thomas Willoughby, who are the children of that family. Typically, the historical record suggests that he was primarily the tutor for the sons, but I think Cassandra's botanical interests and her own kind of scholarly facility suggest that there's some ongoing connection there as well in terms of how his tutorship may have shaped her life as well. He also serves, and this will come back to us again, he also serves as an executor of his friend's will, and so is charged with overseeing the will and overseeing their inheritance. So when Cassandra and her brother Francis moved to Wollaton Hall as teenagers, they were very keen to reestablish and care for their father's legacy. They had separated themselves from their stepfather, Josiah Child, who's the founding member of the Royal African Company, after a very difficult court battle in which Francis sued for control of his father's estates. In returning to Wollaton as teenagers, they went back to a home that they had never lived in and one that needed to be rebuilt and renovated extensively. The estate had been built by their great-grandparents during Elizabeth's reign, but it had been damaged by a fire and had not been lived in for about 45 years. So this is a house that's been empty for 2 generations, and they're coming back to rebuild it and reestablish it. And just to give you a clue of the kinds of people that these were, they have multiple sort of unoccupied estates that people can flee to when there's family disagreements, right? So we're talking about a rather rarefied level among the Willoughbys. Now, Francis Willoughby, the younger, died in 1688, but his younger brother Thomas took his place. So Cassandra continued in her position in the house until her brother's marriage a little bit later. So Thomas and Cassandra, upon the conclusion of the lawsuits with their stepfather, brought their father's papers, Willoughby Sr.'s papers, including some of John Ray's papers as well, the books, drawings, and collections of eggs, insects, and plants to Wollaton. They brought them from Middleton, another closed-up family estate, right? So this is the kind of people we're talking about, where they'd lain in relatively benign neglect since Emma's marriage to Josiah Child. Then commenced a riot of cataloging, as the siblings reviewed the collections and ordered them for their new home. George Antrobus, who had served as the chaplain in their father's household, assisted in drawing up a catalog of the books, which was roughly 2,000 volumes, listing them in a paper catalog by press, by shelf, and by book number. So again, connecting objects with places, which I think it's interesting to think about how that's different from what we tend to do with catalogs today, which sometimes they're linking objects with places, but oftentimes with linked data, it's the linked data kind of merging through the cloud, and so dissociated from a kind of singular location. But this is a catalog that is tied to a place. Cassandra and her brother themselves dealt with the natural curiosities, so shells, plants, those sorts of things. Cassandra, describing the work that she and her brothers did, wrote, "It was a vast business for us to clean, label, and put them in order, which we were fain to do ourselves, fearing that the servants might make mistakes and pull such tender curiosities to pieces." So this is a work of cleaning, of relabeling, also of taking what are loose, dried plants, things that are beginning to be in a fragmentary state, and pulling them together so that they can be conserved and preserved. I think we should see this as a kind of scientific work, scientific labor, and in fact, you can make really close comparisons between the way that John Ray and Francis Willoughby described the work that they were doing in the 1660s when they originally collected these materials and began to set them in order. So for example, they take a copy of one of John Ray's botanical books, The History of Plants, they have it disbound, and then they insert or interleave coarse paper and then mount the plant specimens in that book, so creating a kind of catalog/museum of one of those collections. They also began some new projects at Wollaton as well, building on their father's legacy, but also sort of extending beyond it. Cassandra wrote of her brother Thomas, "His genius led him chiefly to pursue the study of nature, and more especially the nature of plants, of which he soon got a large collection and made himself a little physic garden there, or medical garden, which plants he after removed to Wollaton. And at Wollaton he enlarged the garden, also made a pretty physic garden to receive those plants which he had brought from Cambridge. Here my brother used often with pleasure to amuse himself." And so this brings us to the catalog of plants, which is contained within and sort of part of this letter that Cassandra Willoughby wrote to her mother. In terms of the kinds of plants that they had in the Physik garden, that it at this point sort of enlarges out into a kind of colonial and imperial project. So John Ray, for example, seeks seeds for the Willoughby children from travelers who have come from Jamaica to take and use and adapt and see if they can grow plants that are native to West Africa and to Jamaica as well. So it becomes a process or a project for testing and trying to understand plants from the Caribbean and from Guinea. So the catalog itself is a simple bifolium, and I've got the transcription there for you. A simple bifolium, a sheet of paper folded in half, fairly typical for letters of this period. One side that's visible here is Cassandra's letter to her mother, which explains the arrival of the catalog and its history. Two sides are the catalog itself, which is a list of plants growing in the Physik garden at Woollerton that have and have not survived the winter. And the last side was reserved for the address and the endorsement, which we'll talk about towards the end. So for the text, I've deferred writing Dear Madame till I have hardly time to get my brother to correct the catalog of plants, which I was forced to write myself, Mr. Pratt, who's the gardener, putting it off. And now my brother has company with him and only time to tell me they are right writ, except 2 or 3 which he altered. But for all that, I doubt several of their names are false Latin. And therefore I desire your ladyship will disown the hand, so a kind of conventional expression of modesty there. Those that have the mark X are now alive in the garden, but none of the others outlived the winter, which the gardener imputed to the dampness of the greenhouse, and several of them are annuals. And then she goes on to talk about the seed of the coral tree, and whether it's the coral tree or the bean tree, and the source. Mr. Doody is Samuel Doody, who's a botanist and plantsman. He was the gardener at the Chelsea Physik Garden in London, which is also a garden where experimental practices are enacted, and plants are studied for their medicinal properties. So some of the things that I think are significant right off just looking at this letter is that it's really a collective that has contributed to this catalog, though Cassandra is the one who's taken the time to actually get it written out and sent off to her mother. She positions it within relational networks of family and society. She compiles it as part of this letter to her mother, or as a letter to her mother, updating her on her and her brother's progress and continuing her father's work at Woollerton. She addresses the letter to her mother via India House in London, her stepfather's place of business. This hints, as do the plant specimens themselves, but we'll get to that in a minute, at the imperial and commercial interests that undergird the catalog that it's passing via the East India Company's residence in London. And then Pratt, of course, is the gardener at Woollerton, Richard Pratt. He's been unable to complete the catalog, but he's provided key information for it and is the one growing the plants in this Physik garden. Willoughby apparently has corrected Cassandra's Latin, though I haven't seen any evidence of corrections in the catalog itself, so it's possible that this is a fair copy or that, in fact, her Latin was just fine. And then, of course, Samuel Doody is a botanist. And it's interesting to me that though Cassandra elsewhere kind of disclaims the role of servants in making this project of collecting and curating and continuing her father's work, she sort of says that the servants would pull things to pieces. There's a clear reliance here on multiple people within the household in order to advance this project. And then, of course, behind this, there are even more extensive networks. So I mentioned that John Ray had supported their efforts by soliciting seeds of Caribbean plants from the physician Hans Sloane, fresh off his time serving as the personal physician to the Duke of Albemarle in Jamaica. And the catalog and the covering letter, I think, show that all told, we want to think about this in the context of, again, relations, a catalog made for particular people and particular persons and advancing family projects. It's not a coincidence, I think, later in life that Cassandra becomes a very accomplished historian who's interested in recording her own family's history and reviewing all of the materials and papers and using them to construct historical accounts. Here, too, we see her advancing projects that have been important to her family. So, thinking about this in relation to the work and the intellectual work of natural philosophy and natural science in this period, what kind of intellectual work is involved in creating a catalog like this? Cassandra cares a lot about proper Latin and specific correct plant names. Though she did not know her father very well, these concerns, of course, reflect his as well as the tutelage that she would have received from John Ray. I think it's also important that this reflects her own developing interest in medicine, a subject in which she took a keen interest, like many elite gentlewomen. These are meant to be medicinal plants, and correct and accurate naming in the catalog would be an important part of establishing whether these plants had specific healing properties. In terms of a difference between a printed botanical catalog of the time, one thing that we don't see here is references to additional or other botanical books, sort of giving us kind of a connecting point for some of these plant names. So we can imagine her doing the research in her father's library, which she's just cataloged, but she hasn't included those references. And I sort of wonder if that reflects a bit more commercial practice, and we'll see the connections to the East India trade and to the slave trade in a moment, and maybe less the sort of academic or scholarly practice of the time period. So taking a look at the plants and what they tell us about some of these connections, how can we link this catalog into a wider world of scientific and medical experiment and imperial commerce? So these are plants that have been sought out and found through the transatlantic trade, through the slave trade specifically. They're plants that are native to West Africa and the Caribbean, including Barbados and Jamaica, where enslaved African laborers grew sugarcane to feed England's ever-growing appetite. The forms of slavery practiced on the sugar plantations were particularly brutal. The work was backbreaking and dangerous, and the planters demanded a constant stream of enslaved Africans trafficked from Guinea to replace those who died under these conditions. Hans Sloane, who supplied some of the seeds and in whose collection this letter now rests at the British Library, participated directly in this system as a physician in Jamaica. His Natural History of Jamaica is replete with anecdotes regarding his treatments, medical treatments of enslaved laborers, which often were towards the interests of the enslavers rather than the health of the enslaved themselves. And he also sought to extract medical knowledge about sort of plants that were indigenous to West Africa and to the Caribbean, and knowledge of how to use those plants from both the indigenous people and the enslaved. So just one example on the list here. About halfway down, there's Suriname Physik Nut, which is a plant that was known indigenously in the Caribbean and also was known to grow in Guinea as well. And it was used by indigenous people and the enslaved as a purgative, so it was taken in that fashion. And Sloane describes its use in that way in the Natural History of Jamaica. And so Sloane is very interested in this catalog and a list like this, because he's interested in identifying Caribbean and West African plants that can be used for medical remedies. Josiah Child, Cassandra's stepfather, and his colleagues at India House, so remember, this letter passed through India House on its way to Cassandra's mother, Emma. Josiah Child would have been similarly interested in the commercial and medical possibilities of plants like these. The Royal African Company, the Crown-chartered joint stock company that managed England's share of the transatlantic slave trade, explicitly instructed its captains to seek out West African plants with medical and commercial potential. So in the instructions given to captains in October of 1693, they were ordered to search out plants, grains, and any other curiosities or rarities to see if they might be of great use and benefit, but are neglected for want of knowledge. If any of them prove on trial to be beneficial or useful either for particular or national interest, such further orders may be given about them as the thing will deserve. So we have a kind of experimental collection process here, but then in addition to that, testing and trial to see if the plants can be grown and what uses can be made of them. So the RAC, the Royal African Company, is engaging in this search for knowledge of the indigenous methods and plants, and it's specifically not just about seeking out the plants, but using indigenous and African informants to find them. At the same time, they're trafficking those people across the Atlantic to serve on the plantations. The experimental practice you see kind of echoing through their records, such that they send future factors after these instructions are sent in October of 1693 to test and search for specific plants that earlier captains have identified. And so I think we can view Cassandra's catalog as a record of experimental practice in this context, right? That it tells us which plants survive the winter and has some reasons why, thus providing to merchants like Josiah Child, physicians like Hans Sloane, valuable insight into the process of acculturating foreign plants and developing them for cultivation in England. And I think Sloane surely saw it that way. He had a habit of collecting other people's letters. So despite the fact that he's not mentioned in this letter and he didn't write it and he's not the addressee, it ends up among his correspondence with other letters that he's collected from his scientific and medical colleagues to serve as a resource for further research and experimentation. And so I think this is where I'd like to conclude, that a catalog can be many things. It can be a work of domestic accounting and record keeping. It can be an act of filial piety, making links in a family history. And it can be a record of experimental practice, linking into and participating in imperial and colonial projects of knowledge and technology. And Cassandra Willoughby's catalog was all of these.
So David, Nelson, and I are going to tag team this, so you'll see me for about 15 minutes and then him after me. Before beginning, we'd definitely like to thank Lynn Ransom and everyone else at the Schoenberg Institute for having us here to speak today at such a wonderful symposium. As I hope will show, the project we'll be sharing with you today has fostered a communal spirit since 1696, and David and I would like to acknowledge the group of scholars and workers whose labor on and around this manuscript over many years has led to the debut of our web interface today. We'd like to thank John Pollock, April James, Betsy Bates, and Will Knoll for their guidance and support. And we'd especially like to thank the current Bee-Hive team, Sarah Jones, Ethan Nelson, Jordan Reed Rogers, Mati Davis, Liam Albritton, and most of all, Doug Emery, without whom the most essential framework of this project would not exist and from whom we've learned so much. With that, I'm gonna start. In 1683, eventual founder of Germantown, Francis Daniel Pastorius, took passage to Pennsylvania after agreeing to serve as the agent for a group of German land purchasers interested in the religious freedom that William Penn's woods provided. Already a prolific manuscript writer, as we can see in this record of his own manuscripts, he continued this practice in the New World on a variety of different subjects, including horticulture, beekeeping, and as we'll see today, in his largest Commonplaced book, that Pastorius produced during the years 1696 until his death around 1720. Sorry about that. I skipped a line. So I just wanted to make the point that the Beehive Manuscript, something that we'd like to mention about it today is that it's kind of about language itself. He produced it during the year 1696 until his death around 1720, and it is currently housed here in the Kislak Center, cataloged as MS Codex 726. Its concept is founded on both a well-trodden metaphor in the creation of commonplace books, as well as a hobby of Pastorius's own. Its complexities are interwoven throughout the entire work, as he refines and redefines the ways in which the physical construction of a beehive informs the construction of his own, quote, paper hive. For Pastorius, documenting his source materials was only the first step in the construction of this manuscript. In his hive metaphor, these books serve as flowers, the quotations he collects pollen. His commonplacing and the construction of the manuscript itself reveals the work of the hive. Quotations are interwoven conceptually into discrete linguistic honeycombs, each of which is explicitly linked to other semantically relevant combs. Today, we'll be introducing you to a project that we are currently working on here at Penn, in which this system of linkage moves from the manuscript page to the computer screen. The Digital Beehive is a web interface that serves as both a digital representation and host of digital tools for researching and working with Pastorius's manuscript. This early modern form of pen and paper hyperlinking lends itself naturally to a web interface and becomes exceptionally more navigable and discoverable in digital form. In order to create such an interface, the Digital Beehive project employs a small team to both develop and utilize various protocols for creating data and metadata for each of these honeycombed entries, both replicating their physical presence in the actual manuscript, as well as creating a dynamic interface that allows users to follow and aggregate Pastorius's own system of cross-references. The Digital Beehive thus lies at the nexus of manuscript studies and digital humanities. Not quite an aggregated database nor a digital edition, this project pushes our understanding of the digital humanities in new directions, as our datasets ultimately serve to replicate, reveal, and share a hyperlinked data system developed by a single author in the early modern period in manuscript form. We hope today to begin to chip away at perhaps our most central guiding question: how do digital formats faithfully replicate pre-digital data systems? About 30 leaves into the book, in one of many versions of its front matter, Pastorius introduces his project thus, and I quote, There is nothing that can be said now which has not been said before. And of all things which have been said before in the English tongue, thou wilt find in this manuscript some little hint, pattern, model, platform, precedent, instance, ensample, example, etc. That's the end of the quote. In this quote, we see Pastorius as a collector of knowledge, a constructor of a particular schema from which we can extrapolate, and, as can be seen by his use of the word precedent, a language learner. In the spirit of this quotation, I'd like to take a brief look at the Beehive in its entirety, because while we will focus more closely on the sections of the manuscript that we have already prepared for the website later on when David comes up to speak, it is important to keep in mind that Pastorius understood this document to function holistically, as a malleable tool, not only as a means of inventorying the English language in particular, but also as one to be a guide for the creative use of language itself. The Beehive has gained a reputation for being an exceptionally confusing document, owing much to Pastorius's malleable understanding of its framework that guided its development over time. In order to make the document more navigable online, we've developed two alternative methods of approaching the manuscript, with the first being a page-by-page browse feature that retains the Beehive's pagination and order. Because the Beehive was rebound in the 1950s and its folio pages are now housed in goatskin volumes, I think I'm actually supposed to stay here. It also has a separate Octavo Index that retains its original form. The website maintains the division of its current physical state while providing context for this somewhat arbitrary division into 3 volumes. A navigational sidebar further divides each volume, retaining Pastorius's own divisions for ease of use. Furthermore, each page has an individual web presence, including metadata that provides a transcription of any general navigational notes written by Pastorius, active page numbers that Pastorius used. Not every page has one of these because it's very complicated because multiple times he renumbers his pages. There are 3 page 88s throughout the thing. It's kind of a problem. And then we also have the sections to which these pages belong, a short description of each page's contents, its range, and the general type of page that it is. And sometimes they have multiple types, and this one is 3 here. In addition to this page browse feature, users can also explore the Beehive by section. Because these sections are interwoven with each other in the original text, this alternative view reveals the detailed organization of these sections, most often through numbering systems, which remain difficult to discern when browsing page by page or leafing through the physical artifact. All 3 view options rely on a single CSV, making it easy to edit or revise the delineations as we continue to work with the manuscript and maybe learn something about page numbers or the way to categorize a page or things like that. This organization reveals that the manuscript is comprised of 9 large sections, as well as additional indices, introductory material, and miscellanea. These main sections can be further delineated into different groups. The largest group of these relies on his most conventional commonplacing, in which he culls the materials recorded in his varying book lists or bibliographies to choose, quote, the best quotations from them to populate his alvearium of, and I quote, singular terms, idioms, manners of style, and speech. It is important to note here that while he does organize this section via singular terms, the cross-referencing found in almost every entry destabilizes the idea that these terms are self-contained and singular, but rather conveys that they exist in a continually developing linguistic environment of interacting nexuses. The second group is comprised of a more idiosyncratic form of recording, in which he records language and quotations gathered from his travels, many of which he previously recorded in earlier manuscripts. These include a section of inscriptions found on myriad surfaces as various as sundials, tennis courts, tables, and highways, quote, gathered out of his own itinerary. And by itinerary, he refers to another of his manuscripts, unfortunately lost today, which recounts a grand tour of Western Europe Pastorius took as a tutor in the 1690s. If you go to the website, there's a bibliography on the website, and there's a biography of Pastorius written by Marion Dexter Learned, a professor from Penn quite a while ago, but he tries to recount this journey, and it's really interesting to read. In another section entitled Emblematical Recreations, Pastorius presents a, quote, recollection, and I quote recollection because here he clarifies that he means he is recording from memory. He always says when he's recording from a different manuscript that he's written previously. Then he has examples of emblems he has encountered in his travels, following a conventional delineation of precepts for these speaking pictures. Instead of providing direct pictorial recollections, he provides illustrative verbal descriptions with mottos organized into a wide breadth of categories. Two further sections that can fit into this group include a section of epitaphs gathered from grave sites he visited during his travels, also previously recorded in an earlier manuscript of his, as well as a section entitled Onomastical Considerations, in which Pastorius, in mostly linear prose, divided into discrete numbered sections, considers naming conventions in a variety of senses and contexts. Taken together, this grouping serves as a kind of primer, very much in keeping with his Baroque German erudition of the sorts of form that poetic language can take. In the third group, Pastorius collects his own, quote, sorry rhymes and whimsical fancies, in which he crafts his own poetry in addition to a list of onomastic symbols that weaves its way through the different sections of the Beehive, which are essentially a collection of short phrases based on initials, mostly F, D, and P, which were his own. And then the majority of the poetry is in a separate section called the Germantown Silva. It's the most multilingual space in the Beehive, in which Pastorius writes verse in his native German, Low Dutch, French, and Latin, as well as of course in English, the main language of the manuscript. As Patrick Urban writes in the newly published Pastorius Reader, this section is, and I quote, a virtual laboratory of styles and influences, end quote. The experiments with genre have an exploratory function, and their subjects serve as mainly a reflection of and interactions with his environs and neighbors in newly settled Germantown. It is important to note that all of these sections contain some system of reference or another, and that Pastorius understood them to be ever-evolving as he continuously arranged and rearranged the contents of what he calls a, quote, portable volume of importation. Furthermore, I'd like to posit that Pastorius thus has a radical understanding of what limits a manuscript page actually has. In the Beehive, and in both a temporal as well as a spatial sense, no page stands alone. Each page is subject to continual change in the form of additions or deletions or references to other spaces, as well as displacement, whether via reorganization of leaves or cancels that reveal shifts in his thinking. In this table of contents, the only one in the Beehive, and one which reveals this malleable understanding of the form a manuscript can take, Pastorius writes that the Beehive, quote, having several times been fenced in by stitching more sheets thereunto, got quite another form or face than its first was, even in the eyes of the compiler himself. Not only does Pastorius record this changing nature of the manuscript's physical makeup in prose, but he also exposes these changes through the page number reorganizations and expansions of each section through cancels and insertions. While his former countrymen were working diligently in Sprachgesellschaften, or language societies, to formalize a poetics of the German language that did not rely on borrowed words and forms from Latin and fellow vernacular languages, Pastorius radically dove into the English language, which he characterizes as such on the same contents page, and I quote, the language nowadays spoken in England and colonies thereunto belonging is not the ancient Briton tongues, no, not the least offspring thereof, but a mingle-mangle of Latin, Dutch, and French, relics or remains of the Roman, Saxon, and Norman conquests. Hence it is that when other Europeans cannot deliver their minds but by expressing one thing by one word, ye English may do it commonly by two, oftentimes by three or four. Pastorius views the multivalence that he finds in the English language to be a fundamentally productive rather than excessive space. Such an understanding thus informs his conception of a dynamic form of readership, a space in which the reader both contributes to the endeavor from his own vantage point and takes what is good and leaves the rest, as Pastorius says. In this lens, we can see that Pastorius's aim is not really to create some sort of complete compendium at all, but rather to foster a dynamic framework that purports active, innovative use of language, a space in which relics and remains are not forgotten nor merely contemplated, but rather incorporated into that which is novel. As John Pollock and Brooke Palmieri attested in a talk given in April 2018 on this manuscript, it is perhaps more honest to understand this manuscript to not be a book at all, but rather a portable collection of notes which resists lone readership in favor of a requisite community of readers actively engaged with the material Pastorius continually collected up until his death, in hopes that this aggregation would be studied and continued by others. He many, many times asks his two sons to continue to fill out the Beehive. They did not, and nobody else ever did. So, writing directly to those sons as the readers for whom the Beehive is made, a readership that continually expands as he versions the text, he eventually says, whoever comes across this, I want you to do whatever you can with it. I don't know what conversations he was having with his sons over time, but in any case, he states, read the same over and over and over, but not overly. Mind what and how you are reading. As we've built the framework for the Digital Beehive, we've been careful to read the same over and over and over, but not overly, in order to retain this kinetic view of critical readership. From this vantage point, I'd like to turn things over to David, who will illustrate the ways in which our digital project thus far, focused on the largest section of the Beehive, the alvearium, attempts to faithfully represent Pastorius's own project for a 21st century readership.
So the alvearium, which occupies the last few pages of Volume 1 and nearly all of Volume 2 of the Beehive, is the primary repository of Pastorius's commonplacing. It collects English language quotations derived from Pastorius's reading, organized around central terms. These terms touch upon a wide variety of topics, including religion, ethics, governance, agriculture, the natural world, literature, language, and much, much more. The first portion of the alvearium is arranged alphabetically. We see this here on the left, providing entries from absence to zoilus. After Pastorius exhausts the space he allotted for his so-called alphabetical hive, he includes additions. This section merely continues his alphabetical hive under a different organizational principle. These additions far outnumber the entries organized alphabetically. However, for the purposes of data entry and as a heuristic for dividing the Beehive into more manageable sections, we call this section the numerical section. Here, Pastorius abandons his alphabetical organization of terms and assigns each term a number. Numbers are then arranged in ascending order. So you might have 71, persecution, or 1326, to debase. To help himself navigate the book, he also constructed a number of indices. Note that these indices mainly help navigate the numerical organization of the second part of the alphabetical hive. While it is easy to find a given entry in the alphabetical part of the alvearium, the arbitrary order of the numerical portion, as a kind of random access memory avant la lettre, requires some sort of tool. We have thus concentrated our efforts so far on annotating these two sections in order both to understand how they are organized internally and also to create a representational model of this linked structure. The Digital Beehive project is the result of these efforts. Pastorius's alvearium contains, as Pastorius has it, common proverbs, witty sentences, wise and goodly sayings, as well as all and singular terms, idioms, manners of style and speech used in the English language. I'm paraphrasing from Pastorius there. If these proverbs and sayings would, quote, supply the place of honey, end quote, the singular terms and idioms would, quote, be accounted, if not for wax, yet for Hive-Dross. Hive-Dross is the material by which bees affix hives to a tree or whatever structure, so the structural building blocks. Each entry explores a building block of the English language that can be deployed elsewhere in the hive. These are just some examples of some entries. The alvearium serves less as a dictionary or encyclopedia, which provide normative definitions for discrete linguistic and conceptual entities, but rather as what Pastorius terms a phraseology, a work which documents the use of language and the types of words that go together. The alphabetical section of the alvearium contains entries for a wealth of topics, including entries on religion, politics, language, the natural world, the new world, and many, many more. A compendium of early modern knowledge, the alvearium is a product of Pastorius's commonplacing, drawing on every possible book he could get his hands on. Pastorius extensively documented these books in a massive book list, which we see 2 pages from here, which provides a nearly comprehensive bibliography of books that were available in early Pennsylvania. In a single entry, Pastorius draws upon a variety of sources, synthesizing information into a multifaceted account of the topic. As Pastorius described it, quote, "The sedulous bee, saith another, doth not time all her thighs from one flower's single virtues. She takes the best from many, and together she makes them serve, not without working that to honey, which the putrid spider would convert in poison." And we're not going to talk much about this bee-spider distinction that Pastorius makes, that he's obviously drawing on a much larger tradition, but it's really important for the entire framework of the Beehive. And this book list, of course, is perhaps a future for the Beehive of trying to link out the entries to the books that he's quoting from. So, on a micro level, the entries in the alvearium connect forms of information. But it is also significant for our purposes that there's a larger organization of the alvearium. Let us look more closely at a single entry from the alvearium. Here we see the entry for abundance. Directly to the right of the title for the entry, we see Pastorius has written add too much, superfluity. Through the use of add, Pastorius directs the reader to topically relevant entries in different parts of the Beehive. These cross-references create a conceptual link between the 2 entries and inform how Pastorius understands a given topic. If we begin to read this entry for abundance, we see quickly that abundance is negatively connoted for Pastorius. Quote, "Many cows, much trouble. Beware that thy comforts prove not snares first, and then curses." So, through directing the reader to too much and superfluity, Pastorius fleshes out the semantic context for an entry. So if we go to too much, we will find similar material with a slightly different inflection. Quote, "Fathom much, but gather little. He that hunteth 2 hares at once gets neither." End quote. All these hares. Each entry is thus not an isolated comb, but is informed by the resonances, commonalities, and links in the various other combs, as the reader, like a bee, moves between the combs, gathering further information about a given conceptual nexus from each. So, the linked entries of the Digital Beehive provide a framework for representing the cross-references and indexing in the alvearium. Here we see the alvearium. The user can click on a given entry and navigate seamlessly to the cross-references, allowing the user to compare and contrast the entries and see the semantic nexuses Pastorius develops. So the website is live, you can see it, but I have screenshots just for time purposes. But I'm going to demonstrate here what we can do with this. So we can search for a term, such as opinion. We click on it in the index, and if we click on that little A there, we're going to go to its alphabetical entry. We can see the cross-references as metadata, and then we can navigate automatically through the chain. So we click on imagination, we click on meditation, we click on deliberation, click on considerateness. This is a very long chain. Most of them are not this long. Click on caution. We can click on providence, God's providence, will of God, and then the chain ends. So we can see here, all we're doing is we're taking Pastorius' cross-referencing and we're just turning it into a link that the user can use so that we can automate moving over many, many, many leaves at once. So cross-references are presented as metadata, which create the links. This metadata also provides the user with a quick overview of the conceptual links in Pastorius' manuscript, and this data could potentially be used as the basis for further computational investigations of the Beehive. Unfortunately, I have to cut a section from my talk where I was going to talk about the technical details, but we are available for questions if you have them, and we'd again like to thank Doug Emery for all of his support and guidance on creating this. So, the alphabetical section uses relatively clear modes of cross-references, but the numerical section and the index have proven more difficult to unpack, and I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about this. So, at some point while writing the alphabetical hive, Pastorius must have run out of space in the contained framework from absence to zoilus of his alphabetical entries. The numerical additions to the alphabetical hive serve as the solution to this problem. He continues his commonplacing, arranging information and cross-references under terms. However, each entry is also assigned with a number to help order and sort the information. This is where Pastorius' system of cross-referencing and indexing becomes more interesting. Pastorius will occasionally include multiple entries under one number. If we look at numerical entries under 89, for example, we can see he has assigned both gravity and lotteries Glückshafen to 89. Now, if Pastorius wishes to refer to a numerical entry, he will usually just use the number. For example, here we have the entry for blockhead, and we can see a number of cross-references here. We also have cross-reference 668, which is really hard to see, but it's up there at the top, and cross-reference to 756. So if we look up 668, we see peasant. Apparently that made sense to Pastorius. 756 is missing, so we don't know what that is. But he gives us only the number, and so that can be a problem. It can lead to ambiguity. Sometimes Pastorius will attempt to disambiguate which entry he means to refer to. For example, in entry 75, self-righteousness, he refers to entry 319, Pharisees. He writes this there. So there he gives us the word, because if we go to 319, we can see we have both righteous and Pharisees. So it's ambiguous. You would look up 319 and you would think first righteous. But Pastorius is deliberately saying, no, I don't want you to go to righteous. I want you to go to Pharisees. But usually he just gives the number and he assumes the reader knows which one is correct. I can tell you that this is not the case. We have had very many cases where we do not know which one he means to refer to. I'm going to refer to some of the most complicated ones in the range of my talk, but this can be very mundane. So, as the Octavo Index primarily serves as a tool for navigating the numerical section, these problems of ambiguity become most acute there. Some numerical references in the index, for example, refer to locations in the manuscript rather than discrete entries. If we look up paradox in the index, we see an A for the alphabetical section and a 201. The A directs us to an alphabetical entry for paradox, as expected. If we look up 201, however, we find an entry for taverns, which has no apparent relationship to paradox. There are some truly wild links in Pastorius, but this is unfortunately not one of them. The preceding page in the manuscript provides a list of Orthodox Paradoxes. And this is the intended point of reference. What this list is doing in the middle of the alvearium is anyone's guess, but Pastorius exploits the proximity of this curiosity to a numerical entry to establish a means of navigating the manuscript. This locational use of a numerical entry is extraordinarily unusual, as Pastorius will occasionally direct the reader to other sections of the Beehive through his own idiosyncratic system of pagination. For example, the entry for B includes a page reference. We see very clearly a P. If we go to page 36, we find a number of emblematical recreations about bees and beehives. But it is not always clear if Pastorius intends a page number or a numerical entry. For example, going back to bees, we have entry 54, and we find false names, which has nothing to do with bees. Page 54 of the manuscript, however, is a title page on which Pastorius unpacks the metaphor about bees that underlines the whole work. The other numerical entries do refer to entries about bees, so this is unusual. The index functions as one locus where the alvearium connects to the remainder of the beehive. We see page numbers and entry numbers as two equally valid, occasionally competing modes of linking information in the beehive. And now the last part of the talk is a little speculative, but if the Octavo Index was written as a tool for navigating the numerical section, we should not be surprised to find that the index also serves to refine and, in a sense, version the numerical section. But there are two indices. The Octavo Index is a newer index, which Pastorius writes to replace an older index found at the front of the manuscript. We have not yet annotated the old index. It might be the next session we annotate. We're considering that. So we have the two indices here. And if we look up a term, for example, persecution, in the Octavo Index, we notice this curious punctuation mark in between A and 1092. If we look up at the old index, we will notice that there are additional entries where we have this strange punctuation mark. So the annotation in the new index, we hypothesize, serves as a cancel, informing the reader that there are additional entries for this header, but that he no longer wishes to reference them. Additionally, there are additional entries for persecution, such as entries 71 and 81, that neither index references. These are both clearly persecution, but we don't see it on either index header. So Pastorius is using the indices to further refine his system of linking and referencing, making the choice to dereference or cancel entries, but also to show the act of doing so. This presents a huge representational challenge for the Digital Beehive. We are able to establish that Pastorius has made a deletion, but reference may still function actively in other places. The alphabetical entry for prosecution, for example, still gives us the cross-reference to entry 71 there at the bottom, which is present in neither the old nor the new index. Do we thus supply the missing entries in the index, in our digital representation of the index? Yet to do so would ignore the deliberate act of dereferencing them. Additionally, how can we best represent these dead links, these cancels and revisions? The entries are clearly not intended to link, so it would be misleading to create a link, and yet Pastorius still denotes the fact that they were once there. And here we might think about some of the problems that people have in archiving born digital objects, which can so quickly be versioned and changed. So this remains an ongoing challenge for the Digital Beehive project. As we attempt to find adequate digital surrogates for this confusing and messy manuscript, we simultaneously make new discoveries about the manuscript, which in turn requires new digital solutions. How do we mark imperfect reference? How do we mark a deletion? How do we display the tension between the organization dictated by the page and the organization dictated by Pastorius' system of linking? As we continue to wrestle with these questions, we can continue the challenge Pastorius himself faced in the Beehive, as he himself implores to the reader, and if by inadvertency, heedlessness, oversight, and neglect, one and the same phrase or saying be inserted twice, I therefore kindly entreat the reader to forgive me, as I forgive him. Whoever hath time to copy this book may not only let alone what he displeaseth, but also class thereafter an exacter method and more lovely order, etc. See page 1. For I own myself to be but a two-footed bee, and we thank you and invite you to visit our project.
Well, that's going to be a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. Let me start by thanking Lynn for inviting me. If you listen to the introduction from Whitney, you will have heard the word Iceland and Icelandic and Denmark and things mentioned several times, so you might find yourself wondering what on earth I'm doing presenting this project. Well, all will be revealed. So keeping track of every book on every subject in every language, Anno 1539. Named after Árni Magnússon, who was Icelandic. There you have the explanation. The Arnamagnæan manuscript collection, which is housed, or half of it now is housed at the University of Copenhagen, consists of approximately 3,000 items, the bulk of them Icelandic, most of them Icelandic, some Danish and some Norwegian. And there are also about 100 manuscripts of continental provenance, including at least 22 from Spain. How Árni Magnússon got hold of these Spanish manuscripts, we're not entirely sure, although we have made some inroads there. They are extremely interesting. They didn't just fall off the back of a lorry, and he didn't pick them up at a flea market. They are very, very interesting, mostly 16th century Spanish manuscripts, including this one. So one of them, AM 337 folio, has recently been identified as the catalogue of the library of Hernando Colón, son of the famous navigator Christopher Columbus, of whom you may have heard. Hernando is occasionally referred to in English as Ferdinand Columbus, but somehow that doesn't have the same ring, it seems to me, as Hernando Colón, which is what I will call him. I'd like to say to all the librarians and lovers of manuscripts out there that this is not the way we store our manuscripts in the Arnamagnæan collection. This was done for purposes of promotion. I hope it hasn't had the opposite effect, but we keep them all in acid-free cardboard boxes and standing up and all that. Anyway, the manuscript in question is, oh, wait. Where's my pointer? There. Ah, there. Okay, let's try this again. The manuscript in question is there. It has recently been identified as the catalogue of the Library of Hernando Colón. This was picked up by a lot of media outlets, and you may have seen this story. It was all over the place. And a lot of them suggested that we must be some kind of idiots, that we were not aware that we had this enormous manuscript in our collection. I should just say that we were well aware that we had it, and we had even catalogued it as a list of authors and their works, or with assessments of their works. The only thing we didn't know was that it had anything to do with Hernando Colón. But I'll explain a bit more about that. So that's allegedly Hernando Colón. It's not a great picture, but it's the only one we've got. I've become quite fond of it, actually. I think he looks like he might have been an interesting chap. He was born in 1488 and died in 1539. He was the second and illegitimate son of Christopher Columbus. His father did manage to get him legitimized by the end of his life, which was quite useful. Anyway, he set out, he accompanied his father on the fourth and extremely disastrous journey to the New World. That he was 13 when they set off, and basically the ships rotted from underneath them, and they were forced to spend rather longer than they had intended in what is now Jamaica. This was pre-Bob Marley Jamaica, I believe. Anyway, he set out to build a universal library, one which would contain, he says, every book on every subject in every language from within Christendom and without. And when he started doing this in the early 16th century, this was just about doable. But by the time he died in 1539, the number of printed books, he was mostly interested in printed books, had already increased to such a great extent that he would never have been able to do it. But that didn't stop him trying. So in the end, his library, which was based at his house in Seville, comprised over 15,000 volumes. So we believe it to have been the largest collection of printed books in the world at the time. He was mostly interested in print, as I say, clearly something of a visionary. And he was not only interested in print, but all kinds of print. So when he sent his buyers out to buy books, he told them to look for the ephemera first. So things like ballads and pamphlets and things like that, he didn't just want big editions of Plato or whatever. And then to manage this enormous, exponentially increasing number of books, he designed revolutionary systems for storing, sorting, and distilling these materials, an information crunching engine of a great power. And essentially, he invented modern library science. And this, I'm not just saying that, this has been or is gradually being recognized. Navigating the ocean of knowledge, that's not just me trying to be clever. He was actually very much aware of what he was doing was analogous to what his father had done. He was somewhat obsessed with his father, as I suppose you would be if your father had been Christopher Columbus. And he had definitely had a vision of doing something similar for the world of knowledge. So he came up with basically the idea of having four. Here we outdo your Beehive somewhat. He came up with the idea of four separate indices or catalogs or inventories. And he liked the idea so much that he put them on his coat of arms, which we have here. And so he had lists of authors, if we take them from here and go clockwise. lists of authors, of sciences, by which he meant subjects, of materials, materialen, by which he meant themes, or what we nowadays call keywords. And then finally, a book of epitomes, detailed summaries of the contents of each of the books in the collection. There was also an abecedarium, as he called it, which is an analytical index of authors, titles, and incipits in alphabetical order, and a registrum, an accessions list ordered by number. In fact, there were two of these. The main register is Registrum B. The Registrum A is called Memoralia de Libros Naufragados, which is a catalog of shipwrecked books. So he kept a record of books that he had bought and paid for but never arrived in Seville because the ships went down that they were on. Says a lot about the kind of person he was, I think. And the accessions list is just simply ordered by number. And all of these are carefully cross-referenced. They all exist in Seville, along with what's left of Colón's books. He left strict instructions as to what was to happen to the library after his death and the money to allow that to happen. The instructions were, of course, utterly ignored, and most of the books disappeared within 3 or 4 years of his death. So there are around 4,000 left in Seville. Just to show you the size of the thing, here are two normal-sized human beings chosen at random, standing next to or behind the book. The Libro de los Epítomes is a paper manuscript comprising 700 in its present state, 974 leaves, 28 of which are blank. It measures 308 by 215 millimeters with a thickness of 144 millimeters. That's around 6 inches for those of you who can't think in millimeters. It's the thickest manuscript in the Arnamagnæan collection. So, not the biggest in terms of size, but in terms of breadth. It is acephalous, lacking probably the first 100 or 120 folios, which is part of the reason why it wasn't identified. There is no indication of what it is. It just starts. It begins in the middle of epitome number 140. The manuscript ends with record number 2,330, but owing to blank and missing leaves, the number of summaries in it is just short of 2,000. So we have summaries of 2,000 books, some of them just a few lines, and some of them up to 30 pages. So this is actually only 2,000 books, summaries of 2,000 books out of a library of 15,000 is not that many, but still. So this was long believed missing until discovered, as it were, in our collection. So what we have is a clean copy of the Libro. Following Colón's death, his principal librarian, Juan Pérez, recorded how the library was organized in a document called Memoria de las Obras y Libros de Don Hernando Colón. And according to Pérez, there were several manuscripts containing the 4 inventories of the library, all of which were left unfinished at the time of Colón's death. He describes these all very carefully. It makes very interesting reading, this Memoria. He states that Colón employed sumistas who were in charge of reading and summarizing each book in the library. This was a really great job. There were 12 of these. From the names that Juan Pérez mentions, they were all Spaniards, but we don't know that for sure. They had to, in order to get the job, they had to take a test at the University of Salamanca, and then they were given in Colón's house, in the library, they were given a room which had a desk and a feather bed, and they were paid quite well by the standards of the day. And they were required to work 5 hours a day, the working hours varied according to the season. So in the summer, the lunch break was 4 hours, the siesta, and in the winter it was only 2 hours because of the light. So this was very, very, I mean, this is, graduate students, you know, you'd love to get a job like this. Anyway, when you have to be paid to read books all day, and you know, and anyway, the records that were prepared by these sumistas would then go into the libro de los epítomes, after which Colon himself had corrected and edited them. So 377 folio contains the clean copy of the libro, presumed lost until now. In the Memoria, the manuscript is described as a big book with sheets in folio written by hand in good handwriting, but he also mentions that there's an older draft manuscript in quarto, which is in bad handwriting. And that still exists, but it contains only about 500 items. We haven't compared them yet, so we don't know if the 500 items in the quarto are the same as the first 500 in the other, or whatever. We have to look into this. I should probably have mentioned at the outset that this is a project which we are about to embark on, so that I haven't reached the stage of our beekeepers here yet. But so Juan Perez says in the Memoria, although I have said that the epitomes that are edited must be corrected, this does not apply to all of them, since some are already corrected. These epitomes have the word vidi written in the margin, which means that such an epitome has been checked and corrected. Finally, there are others that were corrected by my master. He often says my master who is in heaven, but not here, and by myself, and they are not marked, although they can be distinguished because some parts of them have been erased and corrected in the margin. So this is an example of one page, or a bit of one page, where Don Hernando, who is in heaven, has looked at them here, because it's written there in the margin, and you can see also some corrections. This will give you an idea of the degree to which some of them have been, I've been told not to move, sorry. This will give you an idea of the degree to which some of them have been corrected. Most of them have not been corrected and have not been seen by Don Hernando, maybe only about 20%, mostly in the beginning of the book. So the others look like they've never, toward the end of the book, they look like they've never been checked by anyone. We've been working on the assumption that all of the summaries are in Latin. That's what we haven't inspected them all yet, but one that's in Spanish did turn up, and it turns out to have been written by Hernando himself. It's item 508. It's a Spanish translation of Le Pèlerinage de Vie Humaine, of which there is a beautiful manuscript in the Free Public Library of Philadelphia, by the way, and it's on O Pen, by the 14th century French Cistercian Guillaume de Digouleville. So this is a Spanish translation of this El Pellegrino de la Vida Humana, which was published in 1490. This book exists in Seville in the library, Biblioteca Colombina, and as with all of Hernando's books, he wrote in it when he bought it, how much he paid for it, and when he read it. So he says here that he started reading this on the 15th of November, 1523, and then finished it on the 21st of the same month. And during this time also wrote a summary in Spanish. So here we have a great deal of information. This is a book that was published in 1490. He didn't read it, he didn't buy it until, well, he says in the next, he bought it for 102 maravedì in 1511. And then he says that this has the registration number of 2,167. So he bought the book in 1490. No, sorry, the book is published in 1490. He bought it in 1511, and he read it in 1523. So he's obviously not in any great hurry, but then he has a lot of books to read. The information in the books themselves is extremely important, because not only did he give, this book was bought in Spain, and so the price is what that he paid is in Spanish currency, but in other cases, because he had books bought for him all over Europe, he gives the price that he paid in whatever the currency of the country where he bought the book, and its equivalent in Spanish with the exact day. So this is extremely important. So on the basis of all this, we can see exactly when it took him 6 days to read this book and to write a summary of it. And then if we look at the, this is a very bad copy of the Registrum B, but you can see that it's, this is the number that he's referring to, and we have the year 1490, etc., and 1511. So it's most of the same information is repeated here. So we have summaries of about 2,000 books. We don't know, but we assume and are secretly hoping that a number of these are books that have not actually survived to the present day. This would be very interesting. So we have summaries of books. We have information about when and where they were bought, when and where they were read, and then we have first-hand experience of people reading them in the beginning of the 16th century. So it's like looking over somebody's shoulder. And we haven't started transcribing this thing yet, but we will. And we have, the ones that we've looked at are kind of interesting. They're a bit like children's book reports. I really liked this one, you know, it was, so this is going to be extremely interesting. So with thanks to Guy Lazur from the University of Windsor, Canada, who was the first person to suggest that our manuscript might have something to do with Cologne, with thanks to Jose Maria Perez Fernandez, who is from the University of Granada, and Edward Wilson Lee, who wrote a book which I cannot recommend too highly, which is called The Catalogue of Shipwrecked Books. Those are these two gentlemen. And especially with thanks to Gilliam Yowers, who's sitting over there, who investigated the road by which the manuscript came to Denmark, and lots of other things as well. And also to our conservator, Natasha Faslich in Copenhagen, and to our photographer, Susanna Reitz. We've done a full collation, which Kiveljim also helped with, and the entire manuscript has been digitized. We're just not letting anyone see the digital images yet, but we have them. So finally, the Libro de los Epítomes project. We intend to produce a digital edition, something like your Digital Beehive, only better, as well as a bilingual Latin-English critical edition of the book in print form. We want to identify all the books that are summarized and link them to all the other information about the books. And then we're doing a larger investigation into Cologne's Universal Library project within the broader currents of biblio and socio-historical study and Hispano-Danish relations in the early modern period. And this will be extremely interesting, we think, trying to work out what the hell these manuscripts are doing in Copenhagen. Edward Wilson Lee wrote to me and said, the discovery of the Libro de los Epítomes represents perhaps the most exciting development in early modern book history for decades and holds out immense possibilities for understanding early modern reading, as well as providing an unparalleled window into learning in the period and promising to reveal secrets about volumes that are otherwise lost to posterity. Funding for this project will come from the Carlsberg Foundation. Yes, them. When I did this PowerPoint presentation the day before yesterday, I hadn't actually heard from the Carlsberg Foundation, but I got a message this morning saying that we have been funded. So timing, ladies and gentlemen, is everything. And that's about it, really. So thank you.